Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Ethicast, coming to you live from the 14th Annual Global Ethics Summit in Atlanta, Georgia. Hi, everyone. It's Bill Coffin, Editor-in-Chief of Ethisphere Magazine and co-host of the Ethicast. And with us today, we have a special guest, Geoff Martin, partner with Baker McKenzie. Geoff, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
So the topic we're going to be discussing today is recent DOJ pronouncements on enforcement priorities and compliance, and what sanctions and export controls enforcement should mean for compliance department and program priorities. Big topic. Looking forward to speaking with you.
10 minutes. Let's go.
All right. So first question is, how has the DOJ's recent approach to issuing compliance and enforcement guidelines differed from prior administrations?
Yeah, and I think the overall approach has been similar for quite a number of years now. We've seen this proliferation over the years of many deputies, attorney generals, memos coming out, incrementally changing DOJ priorities over the years. We've seen alongside that an equal proliferation of compliance program guidelines, initially very much focused on the FCPA and the Joint Resource Guide with the SEC there. More recently, broader from a compliance perspective with the compliance program evaluation guidance and things like that. So I think the approach generally has been consistent through that time and how that's gone about, with a brief respite during Rod Rosenstein's tenure, who kind of objected to that approach and hit pause on that. But I think the message is it's very much back, and the volume of guidance and memos we've seen coming out from Lisa Monaco and the criminal administration at DOJ over the last couple of years has been really voluminous. And I think that while the approach has been changing, the volume and the amount of guidance and its complexity, both in building on the prior guidance and then the very new guidance, is really what's new and what's been challenging for a lot of folks looking at that from the compliance department.
Yeah. So compared to the last update to the compliance program evaluation guidelines in 2020, how different is this new update? And in your view, what are the key takeaways from the latest 2023 update?
Yeah. So there are really two topics that this latest version of the compliance program evaluation guidelines hits, and they're both previewed in the latest Monaco memo from earlier this year, which hits on the topic of ephemeral messaging and how companies need to be setting policies and procedures in advance to make sure they're governing everyone's WhatsApp use and personal phones, bring your own device, all the complexities around that when you get into an enforcement and investigation scenario, when the government's asking you to produce data, much of which is now not sat on email servers and laptops the way it was 5 years ago. All of the stuff that DOJ and us doing internal investigations are interested in is in the phones. And the second big area and challenging area is this idea of employee compensation incentives and particularly clawbacks. And I know this has caused folks a lot of heartburn. And this goes hand in hand with the new pilot program that the Department of Justice put out over the next 3 years, which is going to require companies that settle criminal cases to be actively seeking compensation clawback from the employees found to be involved in wrongdoing. That's found its way into the compliance program evaluation guidelines as well. Other than that, few changes around the edges, but those are the two real material changes.
Yeah. So with the new guidance in mind, can you share a list of priorities for compliance leaders to consider and why?
Yeah. And so I think of those two, those probably fall on the plate of different people. So I think if you're involved in the technology part of your business or in the investigations part of your business, you really want to make sure you've got ahead of time your arms around what you're going to do in an investigation context to satisfy those requirements about getting at ephemeral messaging, folks' phones, BYOD and that sort of thing. On the other side, we've really, over the last couple of months with this new pilot program, been talking to a lot of companies about, from an employment perspective, how to implement these incentives and the clawback of compensation. And that's been really challenging for a lot of companies, because it's just not something people have done before.
Right.
Except for a very narrow set of company in the public company context, Dodd-Frank requirements to claw back for financial misstatements. This potentially blows it much broader, and particularly where we're dealing with a lot of international, multinational companies trying to implement those kind of policies and navigate the employment rules, particularly outside of the US, I think has been a real challenge. So I think making a foray into that is a challenge, and something that people ought to be focusing on to get some way down that path.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to turn to the topic of sanctions for a moment. Could you share with us some recent sanctions and export controls guidance and enforcement trends in the United States?
Yeah. So one of the reasons we kind of jammed these two topics together is that one of the recent guidelines that's come out from DOJ has been this guidance on compliance with sanctions, and this comes from the DOJ's National Security Division.
Right.
And is guidance on how to comply with the myriad of new sanctions that have come out in connection with the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so this is an area, I think, which is really coming into focus for a lot of compliance departments, and certainly on the enforcement side, because we've got the combination of what has always been a set of really complicated sanctions and export control rules, which has been turbocharged by the Russia situation, getting ever more complex related to China, and enforcement is really ramping up as well. I think the Russia sanctions and export controls that were put in from an administrative perspective over the last year didn't have the teeth that the government were expecting or hoping, or the effect on the Putin regime that everyone thought that they might do. And so the civil regulators at the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department are doubling down on their enforcement, and their counterparts in the National Security Division as well are ramping up enforcement, and we're seeing a lot of cases being brought in that space at the moment. And the coordination there and this new guidance issued by DOJ is kind of indicative of that, moving into the space that we've seen the FCPA kind of occupying for so many years now.
Yeah. Now you just mentioned enforcement and having the teeth to make these sanctions stick. So on that front, I'd like to ask, what is the one thing that you would recommend that companies should consider when it comes to increased enforcement actions in the U.S.? And what would you say is kind of driving this uptick in enforcement itself?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that drive in enforcement. I think we talked about one with the just trying to make those sanctions and export controls have more teeth. The other is that we're seeing a lot of active circumvention of those sanctions and export controls, starting off in a relatively unsophisticated way in circumventing a lot of US products via third-party countries, but getting ever more sophisticated in terms of Russian companies working out very sophisticated ways now to get those manufacturing commercial products into Russia that are prohibited. And so I think the one thing that companies can do and double down on is making sure that they're not getting duped essentially by customers who might look like a customer in a safe country or even in the US, but might show some of the red flags that are coming out in this latest guidance, that the end customer or some of the payment structures might be hitting on Russia, because it's getting more complicated and easier to trip yourself up on.
Indeed. Well, Geoff, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Of course, my pleasure.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Ethicast. I'm Bill Coffin. We have our special guest, Geoff Martin, partner, Baker McKenzie, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much for tuning in.